Waterloo Center for German Studies and the Department of Germanic and Slavic Studies at the University of Waterloo. I'm pleased to welcome you tonight to tonight's author's reading. Christopher Kloeble joins us tonight as a guest of the Goethe Institute. Born in Munich, he studied at the Creative Writing Program Leipzig and the University for Film and Television in Munich. He has held teaching assignments and residencies in Germany, the US, and India, among other places. Christopher is a playwright, scriptwriter, and novelist. His plays U-Turn and Memory have been staged in major theaters in Vienna, Munich, Heidelberg, and Nuremberg. His first film script, Inclusion, was produced in 2011 and nominated for Best Picture Script for 2012's Prix Europa. Well, it doesn't, anyway. In 2008, his work, Amongst Loners, won the Jürgen Ponto Stiftung Prize for Best Debut Novel. His second book, Knock at the Door, which is a collection of short stories, was published shortly thereafter in 2009. His third book, Meistens alles sehr schnell, was published in 2012. And fortunately for us, it was translated into English by Aaron Kerner and published in 2016 by Grey Wolf Press as Almost Everything Very Fast. And it is from this book that Christopher will be reading tonight. His new novel, The Shadows of the Sotz Family, has just been released in Germany. Christopher was busy over the last three events at this year's recently held Toronto's International Festival of Authors. When not visiting us here in Ontario, Christopher lives in Berlin and Delhi. And following the reading, there will be an opportunity for a question and answer session. So I ask you to please join me in welcoming Christopher this evening.
It's always one of the main practices as a writer that you get used to people watching you drink water. And you wouldn't believe how, in the beginning, how difficult that task is, because you're so aware of every part of a second drinking it that you always spill yourself because you try to make it very fast. It's not, it's the first practice you get. Thank you so much for the introduction, and I'm very happy to be here. You might be surprised, but it's my first reading here. It's been now a week since I arrived and had a very good time in Toronto. And today I told, when I was at the university, I told the students already it's very nice to come back because I've been to Canada once before. And the last time I went, I was starting a road trip, and I started it in Toronto with my ex-girlfriend there. And unfortunately, when the road trip was supposed to start in Toronto, that was the same day when we broke up. So I went, we were actually on, you won't believe it, we were on the CN Tower, and that's where everything happened. I remember looking through the glass into the abyss, So now I created a much nicer memory, which is good. I'm going to read from my third book. It's very nice with this book because in the German version I always write down the places where I had readings so far, and it's nice to get to travel around the world with it. It's at the heart of the story. It's about a relationship between a father and a son, Albert and Fred. Albert is 19 years old. In the beginning of the story, he just finished school and he moves in with his father because they just have found out that he has not that many more months to live. Albert always had this issue with his father that he had to be a father for his father because Fred is a little bit, as they say in the small village, slow in the head. He doesn't understand a lot of things, or maybe he understands them just in a different way. And he, for example, doesn't really understand the concept of the birds and the bees, and so he could never tell his son who his mother is. Albert doesn't know who his mother is, and he really would like to know, and he especially now would like to find out because his father is not going to live that much longer. So they embark on an odyssey in this book and try to find a mother while time is pressing. of course, they find out all kinds of things, but some of them they didn't want to find out about the past. Small Bavarian village, 20th century, first half 20th century Germany, all these situations. And so there's a different story also in the book that is that you read parallelly, and that is about the background and the history of that village that has, well, also some dark secrets. I'm going to read two short excerpts. The first one will be a little bit about Albert's past when he was still a little bit younger, because when he was a child, there was a very specific moment when he realized for the first time that his father is not like any other father. He until then, when he was like early first few years, he thought his father was just a great guy, and actually he even thought he was a hero because he had saved a few people during a bus accident that had attacked the bus stop in his village. So, yes. As a child, he remembered he had loved Fred for this more than anything, that people called him a hero. Back then, he'd seen Fred as an even greater hero than He-Man or Raphael, the turtle with the red bandana, named for some other Raphael that Sister Simone was all gaga over. At St. Helena, Albert bragged about Fred, thereby drawing the envy and hostility of all the other orphans who not only didn't have heroes for fathers, they had no fathers at all. Why did he live in St. Helena if Fred was so great? They asked him, and shook their heads maliciously. Albert ignored that. Sister Alfonsa had prepared him for such situations. He followed her advice. Sister Alfonsa is kind of a surrogate mother for him. He followed her advice, didn't stick his tongue out at the other kids, and told himself that because they didn't have anyone, they wanted to be like him. They were just being jealous, petty. And that helped Albert, who was the only one of the younger kids in the orphanage who knew what petty meant. At St. Helena, Albert favored the lower mattress in a bunk bed, on the one hand because he was no lover of heights, and on the other because he could decorate the underside of the bed above him with what he wanted to be the last thing he'd see before falling asleep. Fred's newspaper report. It's a report about how he saved a few people. Even back then, he had never called Fred father. As a 1-year-old, he'd called him Ped, then Fed at 2, and a few months later, he was proudly gurgling Fred. Annie had told him to, and after Annie's death, Sister Alfonsa wanted to stay that way, which confused Albert. Often he wanted to call him Papa, with an elongated second A that opened the throat and cleared the mind, whereas Fred curled his tongue and sounded like an out-of-tune doorbell. Yet he trusted the nun, for in spite of his precocious mind, he was still small enough to believe that adults, among whom he counted Fred, knew everything and always did what was right. It wasn't until age 5 that he realized how wrong he had been. During a visit to Königsdorf, where he had grown up, he and Fred lay, as usual, on the chaise longue in the living room in front of the television set. Albert couldn't recall anymore which program had been playing at the time. He'd never cared much about that. For him, the important thing was snuggling up against Fred and feeling his inextinguishable warmth. And that's how it had been that evening when Albert, needing to go to the bathroom, had walked himself loose from Fred, whose gaze never slid from the TV even for a moment. After Albert had pressed the flush on the toilet, he stood there waiting for Fred's sake. That's because Fred has this idea. He lost his father due to drowning, but he didn't really believe that his father drowned. He just thinks he's still somewhere in the sea, and he believes that maybe at some point he's in a sewage, and maybe at some point he'll come back. So every time he hears the toilet flush, he can't deal with it. He thinks maybe Daddy is coming back. After Albert had pressed the flush on the toilet, he stood there waiting for Fred's sake until the sound of the rushing water had subsided before opening the door again. When he bounced back into the living room, feeling almost perfectly happy, he saw it. Even before Albert first beat sister Alfonsa at chess, even before he wrote his treatise with essays cobbled together out of quotes script from German writers, never getting caught, even before he began learning the English version of his favorite book, The Hobbit, by heart, even before he baptized a stray dog, Max Moritz, and trained it to pilfer sausages from the convent kitchen, even before, bored by the inflationary use of kindergarten curse words like dummy or poopy butt, he started to call his envious peers crétins. Even before he explained to said crétins, who, when exam time came around, scored worse than he did across the board, that his namesake, Einstein, had never been a poor student, merely Swiss. Even before all of this happened, Albert understood for the first time just how little his father understood. Fred was lying in exactly the same position on the chaise longue, but his gaze didn't reach what was happening on the screen. He was staring in its direction with the concentrated yet unambiguously desperate expression of someone marooned on an island scanning the horizon for ships. The first words Albert addressed to Sister Alfonsa after that visit were, "Is he crazy?" Alfonsa greeted him with a bear hug and one of her standard tooth-concealing smirks. Back when she was a child, people had put little stock in either tenderness or orthodontics. She was famous far beyond the walls of St. Helena for her inscrutable facial expressions. Albert himself had once witnessed how an adventurous orphan, Rupert, had mistaken her smirk for a suppressed smile as he clambered up onto the unstable roof of a garden shed, accompanied by her shouts that he should definitely go on scrambling, there would be absolutely no consequences. She thought it was an excellent idea if only all the boys were daring enough to try to break their necks. A penance of 50 Our Fathers had brought Rupert considerably closer to an understanding of the concept of irony. Some people thought everything Sister Alfonsa uttered was devoid of emotion, but even as a child, Albert had felt this was only half the story. It sometimes seemed to him as if she'd found her way to St. Helena by mistake. Something about her just didn't fit there. What exactly it was, he couldn't say, but he had a suspicion it was connected with how seldom she left the building and how often she listened to Frank Sinatra. Is Fred crazy? This time, Albert pronounced the question as if he was expecting a yes. Sister Alfonsa shut the door to her office and led him over to a little table on which a chessboard of stained boxwood was waiting. To the left and right of it stood wooden stools. Lately, she'd been teaching him to play chess, an honor she bestowed only every few years on an orphan who, in her opinion, had great potential or, as she phrased it, seemed bright enough. In Alfonsa's lessons, chess pieces were dispensed with. In her opinion, a clever enough mind could make do with checkers. Memory would take care of the rest. Albert hesitated. He had little desire to play, but he also sensed that he had no other option if he wanted to hear her thoughts. Faint daylight fell through a tiny window. It was another of those murky autumn afternoons. Albert took his seat. His feet didn't reach the floor. For a moment, his hand hovered above his bone-white troops before opening the game in classic fashion, pawn to e4. The nun mirrored his move, pawn to e5, and then sat down. You think your father is crazy? Yes. Maybe we are too. No way. How do you know? Albert made his next move, knight to f3, which she again mimicked, knight to f6. Okay, she said. Let's assume that we are not crazy and Fred is. Isn't that merely our thesis then? Albert wrinkled his forehead, knight takes pawn. Alfonsa didn't likewise. What's a thesis? A beginning, she smirked. In our society, the stronger rule over the weaker. A clever little fellow like you declares, Fred is crazy. And because Fred is hardly capable of refuting you, everyone concludes that you're right. I am right. Pawn to d3. So guilty until proven innocent. pawn to d6. And what if we're wrong? Pawn takes knight, and likewise. What if we're crazy? What if the whole world is controlled by madmen who lock away all the sane people like Fred, so that nobody gets wise to them? That's not possible. Says who? Me. All children are crazy, said Alfonso. Why? Well, as the stronger of the two of us, I've just decided it. I'm not crazy. You are now. Albert slammed down a game piece beside the board. I don't want to play anymore. It was just an illustration, she tousled his hair. Do you really want to know what I think? He nodded and looked at her obliquely from below to express that he wanted to be taken in her arms. You are both perfectly insane. No ambiguity intended. Albert might have understood less than half of what she was saying. Even his brightness had limits. But he could feel that this time she was speaking with admiration. That's good, he said, and just to be safe added, right? Not special, she said, and the very reason why you can only ever call him Fred. He'll never be a proper father. I can explain it to him. Sister Alfonso smirked. Nobody can do that. Not even you. A week later, Albert ran away from the orphanage for the first time. Over the following month, he absconded on 4 separate occasions. Thereafter, he repeated his escape attempts with reliable regularity. On average, he made around 20 per year. At first, he failed because of the bus drivers who wouldn't let some squirt, especially a smart alecky squirt, ride unaccompanied by a grown-up. Often enough, the other orphans ratted him out. But even when an attempt succeeded, the nuns were barely ruffled. They knew where he was going every time. And why? I'm your son, said Albert to Fred. You're Albert, said Fred to Albert. And I'm your son, said Albert. And you're my father. I'm Fred. And my father, Fred blinked. Do you understand me? Asked Albert. I always understand everything, said Fred. What did I say? You said, do you understand me? I understand you, Albert. And before? You said, and my father. Do you understand that? Yes, said Fred, and I'm hungry. I come from you, said Albert. Without you, I wouldn't exist. And Fred said, thank you. That's nice. Can we make pancakes with raspberry jam? Pancakes with raspberry jam are ambrosial. That's his favorite word. Later, at St. Helena, there was always a later at St. Helena, Albert would fight his disappointment by reading Fred's newspaper report each night before falling asleep and imagining that the child Fred had saved was him. He always hoped and sometimes believed, and occasionally knew, that someday Fred would come and rescue him, that in the middle of the night Fred would storm into the dormitory, flip on the lights, run to his bunk, and take Albert with him. Where to was negligible. All that mattered was that it be away. But the passing years withered his hope. Even his boundless longing couldn't shield him from that. Again and again he ran to Fred, counter to Sister Alfonso's claim. It will work this time, he told himself, incorrigible. This time, Fred will get it. And then Fred got nothing at all. It was all the same as ever, and Fred was simply Fred. Okay, so this is from the contemporary part of the book. And of course, shortly later, a few years later, when they find out about Fred's heart problem, they embark on this journey, and well, they go into sewage system, and they go to an airport, and they go into the mountains and trying to figure out where this mother could be or who she could be. We have this term in Germany. I just today mentioned it in a conversation, and what they're doing basically is a what you call scavenger hunt. Here we call Schnitzel hunt in Germany. Yeah, so, which doesn't mean that you're looking for schnitzel, of course, but I wonder, maybe that's what it originally meant. So I'm going to read the second passage is a bit shorter. It's about this other story in the book, which is, of course, in many ways connected to theirs. And it's about this town where Fred grew up in. And it's this town has a very similar name as the village where he grew up in, but there's something different about it. Maybe just because it's in the past, but maybe also because many things have changed over the years. So, and this little town is very deep in the Alpine foothills, or in the Alps actually, of the German part of the Alps. I don't have to explain anything else because it's just the beginning of the chapter. And it's called the Sacrificial Festival. On a hot August night of the height of the summer of 1912, the village of Segendorf celebrated its 386th Sacrificial Festival. 387 years earlier, a wandering monk, expelled from his monastery, had paused for a rest at the highest point of the very same hill. He dozed off in the shade of a little grove of spruce trees. God had appeared to the monk in his dream, demanding he prove his devotion to his Creator by sacrificing his most beloved possession. A princely reward awaited him. So it happened that, after awakening, the desperate monk, banished to the thinly populated region of the Alpine foothills, approached the rocky bluff on the south side of the hill, drew out a brass chalice, which he'd purloined from his former monastery as compensation, so to speak, for his exile, and after a brief hesitation, allowed it to tumble down into the abyss. He waited for a sign, waited and doubted. Then, at last, a delicate, tinny pling came echoing up over the lip of the cliff. There should have been a plong. Brass against stone, a plong, absolutely. But instead, there followed a pling-pling. It was mocking him, that pling-pling, calling, "Come look for me, come on down, come to me." And the monk heeded its call. Down below, gleaming metal ran like a jagged scar through the stone. The monk caressed every inch of it, as if he were kissing the Holy Father's piscatory ring. The newly uncovered vein of gold considerably eased his ascent from destitute drifter to bishop. He consecrated the spot, calling it Segenhügel, the blessed hill. And soon, thanks to the exploitation of its gold deposits, the village of Segendorf sprang up nearby. Before it had time to develop into a thriving community, however, Segendorf began to wither. On the one hand, the mine petered out within months. On the other, the landscape itself significantly contributed to the settlement's ruin. Hereabouts, there was little but fields scattered with scarlet corn poppies, the Moorbach, a piddling tributary that wound its way around the Segenhügel, lean game, and hostile grasses that sliced at your hands if you tried to pluck them. When the villagers decamped, the old, the sick, and the idiotic were left behind, along with the tradition. At first, the remaining Segendorfer celebrated the discovery of the gold mine each summer by flinging their most beloved possessions over the edge of the cliff. But as too many animal cadavers had begun to pile up at the foot of the hill, contaminating the drinking water, they decided instead to kindle a sacrificial bonfire each year on the market square so as to celebrate the ritual in a more civilized fashion. Back then, the population of Segendorf numbered no more than 300 souls. Of course, there were barns and cowsheds and cesspits. The cobbler right next to the general store, the butcher just behind, and the smithy not much farther off. Of course, Segendorf had a moor to the east and the west, and the sheer rock walls of the Alps to the south, and to the north the sole road that led into the village, and ended there as well. And of course, just beyond the town limits, there was Wolf Hill, atop which an oak tree spread its limbs, and beneath which local women were knocked up every year when spring rolled around. But for anyone who took the map as gospel, Segendorf didn't exist at all. The place had barely changed since its founding. Light was still generated with sulfur matchsticks, candles, or torches. The people still scrubbed their clothes in the Moorbach, and the next parish was a 10-day march away. The residents first heard about World War I only after it had been lost. In 1912, all the villagers gathered in the market square, as they did every year, formed a spiraling line, and one by one hurled something dear to their hearts onto the flaming pyre of high-piled brushwood. The flames swallowed them noisily, rewarding those assembled with warmth and light. That same night, in the granary, Segendorf's largest structure after the church, a secret was conceived. Among sacks bursting with oats, wheat, poppy seeds, and barley, sacks that in the gloom resembled limbless torsos, 14-year-old Josfa Habom explored the body of his sister Jasve with his lips. And although both felt unbearably hot, they trembled, as if they were killing frost. It was said that no Segendorfer could compete with my parents' beauty. So tantalizing was Jasfa's glance, so striking Josfa's dimpled chin, that the pair were never invited to weddings, lest the bride or groom begin to have second thoughts about the business at hand. Anne-Marie Habom, my grandmother, had died giving birth to the twins, and my grandfather Nick Habom, one of Segendorf's numerous hunters and a considerably unattractive man, concerned himself only with putting enough food on the table and making sure that the two had a warm bed to sleep in. He never said more than was absolutely necessary. He was respected for that. In spite of his dwarfish stature, Nick was a man who loomed large in people's memories. Many maintained that the vertical crease between his eyebrows divided not merely his forehead, but also the compartments into which he sorted mankind. Those whom he liked and the rest, among whom he numbered his children. Just recently, he had broken Josfa's nose because the latter's hand had slid between his sister's thighs while they were bathing. "Don't put your hands on each other," he'd bellowed. Since then, Josfa's beauty had been marred. But Nick's harshness drove the two children even closer together. Though they didn't dare oppose him openly and kept their hands to themselves, as he had ordered them to do, they nevertheless took advantage of every minute they were alone to secretly rub their pale bodies against each other, until they were crimson. On the night of the 386th Sacrificial Festival, the pair stole away and raced to the granary. Sneezing, they undressed themselves in the dusty air, tied their hands together behind their backs, and fondled each other with their feet, caressed each other with their noses, kindled each other with their tongues. They smelled sweetly of elderberries and holy water, and down pillows aired in the west wind. The next morning, Jasve was seized with elation. While outside, a warm wind scattered the ashes of the most beloved possessions that lay charred in the market square, spinning grey-black dust devils through vegetable gardens, inflaming eyes and coating window panes with sooty muck. She felt a pleasurable tingling beneath her belly button that grew stronger and refused to fade, as if Josfa were still kissing that spot. In the months that followed, Jasve concealed her swelling belly from curious eyes. Her dread of her father was surpassed only by the fear that she might give birth to a Kloeble. When it came to begetting children, Segendorfers weren't always choosy. It frequently happened that somebody's brother was also his cousin, or somebody's daughter also her sister. Quite a few local families had produced a Kloeble, a clumsy, stupid fellow. Mothers of such children were spat upon. They were accused of having no pride, of having seduced their own father's sons, brothers, because hideous, impudent, and slothful as they were, no other man would take them. Kloebles were known for chewing sorrel all day long, filling with themselves shamelessly in public, and playing patty cake with cow dung. They also argued passionately among themselves about whether God existed, somebody none of them had ever seen, and about why nobody believed in them, the Kloebles, although they were easily visible, and whether perhaps they wouldn't be visible any longer once people started believing in them. The incest had another side effect, though. It helped Segendorf remain hidden behind a wall that had never been built. Anyone who wanted to could have seen and entered the town. But nobody from elsewhere wanted to see it, much less enter it. In spite of her fear of having a Kloeble, Jasper would of course still love such a child. That's what she told herself and what Jasper told her. But a perfectly healthy child would be easier to love. For 5 long months, she wore a shawl wrapped tightly as a corset around her belly and endured the pain. Only then did she decide to confess the pregnancy to their father. She searched carefully for the appropriate words, weighing one sentence after another for days, until she saw that the right moment had come. While Jasper checked the toad traps in the swamp, Jasper sat down beside Nick on the wooden bench in front of the house. In the evening light, her father picked filth from beneath his nails with a hunting knife and whistled a melancholy tune. Jasper gathered her courage and spoke her first sentence. She spoke her second sentence. She spoke her third and fourth and fifth sentences. And after she'd spoken her last sentence, she waited. Calmly, Nick laid the knife down beside him, pressed his lips together, drew a deep breath, and grabbed her by the neck. Only then could she see the minuscule tears slipping down his face. Silently, he increased the pressure. Black spots flecked her vision, multiplied, melted together, and she tumbled into a lightless void. When she came to, she was lying alone in the mud by the wooden bench, and later that evening she was unable to hide from her brother the pale purple bruises on her throat. From the next hunting trip with his father, only Jasper returned. Nick was never found, and the twins never spoke about what had happened out on the moor. It was said in the village that Nick had been smothered by quicksand, and because he'd been unpopular in Segendorf, nobody asked any questions. From then on, my parents shared a bed every night. Soon they couldn't sleep unless they were lying naked beside one another, each with a hand resting on the other's sex. Their hands were comforting shields, intimate and impermeable. Thanks for listening. So how shall we go about it?
So we're going to have time for questions here. We have actually a good amount of time. So if anybody has anything, I'll open the floor. Go forward.
I'm curious how it feels to read your text in English. Have you done it frequently? I guess you did it in Toronto? Or?
Yeah, I've done it a few times. I mean, earlier this year, at the beginning of the year, actually, I went for a book tour in the US, which was very interesting. I mean, of course, it's interesting, first of all, because it feels like it's the same. It's my text, but then again, it's also not my text, since certain things are the same. Certain things work a little bit better. There are other things that get lost in translation. Like, for example, there's this thing, like, it's just often things that are plays with words, then it doesn't. Yeah, it's very hard to find a corresponding thing in a different language. Like when the father and son are sitting watching TV in German, there's for watching TV you say like it's a word which is the same word for far looking. And so I describe it that they're watching TV, but at the same time, the father doesn't really understand what's on the TV, so it seems like he's just looking very far, but he doesn't see anything. So it's a play with that word, which just doesn't work in English. So you just have to, drop the pun and be happy with it. But then again, other things work also very well. Like in general, my observation is often that irony works a little bit better in English, which has probably several reasons. One of which is that people have a higher sensitivity for it in the English-speaking world. So in Germany, it can go this or that way. It depends a little bit on the part of Germany you are in, but like my very general experience, and that really there's no difference really between India and UK and Ireland and North America, is that just people have a better understanding of the idea of irony, so which is good. So it's a nice experience, and it's very good in that sense, because otherwise I would just feel like I'm still traveling with a book I wrote 4 years ago, or that was published 4 years ago. But in that sense, it's almost like a new book, and it's still much better the experience than, like, for example, the first translation ever was sold to Israel. So when I went to Israel for readings, of course I couldn't read in Hebrew, but what I did is I did read a little bit in German, and then they had a simultaneous translation, and people had just like microphones and stuff. But that is very strange as an experience. It's almost like watching a movie that is dubbed very terribly, because you see the mouth moving, but the text doesn't correspond. Really, what you hear doesn't sound like the person is actually saying it, and that's how it feels if you have the reading, because you read, and you know that, I don't know, this a specific sentence works really well. People always have a reaction to it, and then nobody reacts to it, and you're like, okay. Usually that is a sign in Germany that it's going to be a tough night, and people are just, I don't know, very grumpy, and I don't know what is going on, but there's something going on. But then you read on, and like 2 sentences later, people just in the middle of the sentence, people start laughing, and then you're like, oh, what happened? So what did I do wrong? So it's like, my pants still on, or what? So it is always a very good experience to travel with a translation, and I'm very happy with this one. So I don't have anything to complain, actually. Yes.
As a unilingual Anglo here, and probably one of the few, was I wrong or right in connecting your name with what you call the result of the people? Is that the same word or similar words, or is it just my non-understanding?
You must have misunderstood. You're the only one in the room.
Do you mind repeating the question back just so that the film catches that on the microphone here?
Oh, okay. Or should we?
This one, right? Yep.
Oh, this one? This one?
Okay. Yeah.
It's fine? Okay. So about the name, there's definitely a connection. A few years back, someone wrote a letter to me who has the same surname, and he said, well, I've made some research, and I found out that Kloeble comes from the word in German klobig, which is something like clumsy, plump. I don't know how you would. The precise translation would be, but it's something like that. And he said it's most likely that it comes from a small village in the mountains, and people were called that way when they were a little bit different, and they probably were that different because in this village everybody, there were not a lot of families, so they were all being a big family with each other. And that's how, through all that, many people turned out that way. And I was like, that's, I have a nice name. But I liked it kind of because I was still also already thinking about this story in this village, and I thought, like, okay, that's interesting because it fits very well together with other stories that I was combining here, and it's that kind of story where you can't prove them, and they're probably only half true, but if they work really well, they're a little bit, maybe they're even more true than what actually happened. And I think and with all the the village where I'm from, also there are all these traditions and heathen traditions and stories that nobody really knows where they come from or why people still do that, but they do it, and it worked really well with that. And I also thought it would be okay to employ it in the sense that if all the geniuses in the village would be called Kloeble, then it would be a bit weird for me to do it. But in that context, I felt like that's okay. So you understood right. But it's interesting how that. What I very often notice at readings is that people do notice that it's like, oh wait, these guys are called like him. And then I noticed that they notice, but then nobody asked. And then, which is very funny to observe, because then you're like, oh, guys, I would really like to explain this to you. Yeah, so, yeah.
I'll ask another one if there's
Sure.
anybody else.
Go ahead.
I can step in.
She mentioned the translation. When you get the translation, do you read it through when you get it? Or are you just doing little pieces of it now? Have you read the whole book in English?
Yeah, I did, and actually several times, and especially this one because I mentioned this today also at the university. It's very tough to get an English translation. It's very rare. Like in numbers, it's always very depressing to hear. But so it seemed like I don't know the exit numbers for Canada, but for US, which is the biggest book market in the world, there's less than 3% of the books published there are foreign language books, and the rest is just written in English. And so these 3%, less than 3%, represent the whole world. Also textbooks, every language. So. It's a very small number, and the irony is that Germany is the second biggest book market with more than 90,000 books on average published each year. But in that context, you usually just get something like between maybe 50 or maybe even 100 books that are actually translated into English. So that was one thing why I wanted to really make sure that when it doesn't really happen very often. I know famous writers in Germany who don't have a translation, and there's no reason. I don't know why it sometimes happens or why it doesn't. It definitely does happen if you're a huge bestseller. I wasn't like a huge, it did well, but it's not the numbers that convince the people. So then I just wanted to make sure that it's, first of all, that you can read it in English and are not reminded on every page that, oh, I can feel how much it is a translation. That's the one thing. The other thing is just the fact that I live half the year in Delhi because my wife is from there, and so we have a big circle of friends that is only English speaking. So for them, I could prove with this book that I actually am a writer, and so I was very happy. But I wanted to make sure that when they read it, that they don't, I didn't want to find out that after them reading it, that half of them are not friends anymore because they're like, that's what you've been writing all along. So, yeah. So I did, and actually with this, what I did is I read sentence by sentence, like similar, like this, like I went like this through the book, because you would think that I know all aspects of it, but you don't. After years, you forget stuff, and it's not that the translation is wrong, but usually a translator is only native speaker in one language, and usually in the language in which he translates to. So this guy, his German is fine, but it's of course not perfect, and so many little things he might miss or misunderstand, and to make sure that as much as possible is being done well, that's what I did, and I often couldn't correct him or say like, oh, this is you have to do it like that. But what I could often feel is like, oh, there's something off here, and then I would talk with him. Or what we also did at some point is that because my wife is a native speaker in English and in German, I could she could actually find a solution.
I want to continue on this and
Yeah.
ask you a bit about it. This is a slightly provocative and frivolous question.
Okay, I don't hear it.
Vladimir Nabokov, and so I'm thinking about problems of translation. Have you ever considered writing in English?
Yeah.
These brilliant precedents of people who, great authors who did so.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's the idea is always not only the idea, but the idea is for many writers very tempting, and I understand it. I also have been thinking about it, but just because for the sake of it's so much, it's easier in the sense that you can reach more people around the world easily. Like with German translations, it's just a fact that not everybody obviously can speak German or read German, even in publishing houses. So getting an English translation is very helpful because then you can actually show the book to much more people around the world. Like in terms of career or selling books, it actually makes sense to write in English. But of course, at the same point, there are so many more people who try to get into that market because that's one of the few markets, just as Germany, where you actually can, if things work out well, you can actually make a living by writing, which you can't in many other cultures. Even if you sell a lot of books, you can't. That is very tempting. But if I would do that, I mean, my English is just too limited. I would always have to find a way or figure out a story where it makes sense that the person who's telling the story is not using perfect English. So I could write a story first person, written in first person, and by a German guy who lives in the US. Then that would work out. But then you limit yourself so much when you do that. So I probably won't do it and just make do with my German. And that's okay because Germany has a very nice, very good publishing scene, and the biggest advantage I see, for example, in the German publishing scene is that there's still something that I would call idealism around, where there's quite a lot of things are being done and published and supported, where everybody kind of knows this is not going to sell a lot, but we still want to do it because we believe it's important to do it. And that's not state or government friendly, that's just plain private industry. So, and that's what I really, really appreciate. And I can see by watching how things work with my wife, because she writes in English, how difficult the English-speaking market has become. Because many of the publishing houses that used to be run by families or individuals that could just decide to push someone because they believed in them, they have all been eaten by bigger companies and conglomerates and whatever, and so they all have to cater to CEOs and to what in the market and so on. So which means that everybody's a lot under pressure, and it's if a book is not at least possibly going to be a success, if it's something where everybody knows that not a lot of people are going to read it, it's very, very tough sell. There might be, if you are successful, there's higher potential, definitely, because suddenly the numbers are like amazing even in Germany, it's like amazing the kind of numbers that are sometimes paid here. But you rise very high, but you fall also very deep, because what happens often is that at some point people get quite a high advance, and then they are like amazed by it, and it's like 6-figure, even 7-figure advances for literary fiction. We're not talking about the next Dan Brown book. It's like literary fiction. So and they get so much money for it that and often based not on a finished book, but even maybe if it's finished, these numbers, they can't be repaid in hardly ever, because you would have to sell to 30 countries, and it has to become a Hollywood blockbuster movie in order to get back that kind of money, which means usually they don't get back, and that was your chance, and then you often don't publish another book. And even if they ask you to write another book and it's a success, I mean, that's a lot of pressure that you know that there was so much money paid, and now you have to repay it, because that's money that has been given to you, and you're fine, but the publisher will lose it if it's not selling, and then they blame you, and they won't do anything else with you because they lost so much through you. Yes, please.
We read the book in English, and we were just curious if the German version, if you use dialect, because it takes place actually in Bavaria, so I could kind of imagine the characters speaking in a very different way.
Yeah, I mean, there's not too much dialect in it, because I did grow up in Bavaria, but my parents moved there when I was 1 year old. So I am sometimes considered Bavarian, but I never felt really very much Bavarian, and my Bavarian is very bad. I mean, it would work for people who don't know Bavarian so well. They think like, yeah, sure, he's. But if I talk to people who don't know it, then what happens is, who do know it, sorry, people who do know Bavarian, then what they call me is the German word is the Bavarian word is Preis, which is the Bavarian for Preuße, which means Prussian. So, and which it doesn't mean that I'm Prussian, it just means that I'm not from there. It's just like, you guys are Prussians, basically. So, that's a difficulty. So there is some Bavarian in there. Like I think there are a few people in the past story who do have sort of like a slight accent thing, but this has been changed because that was, for example, that's a very difficult issue. How do you deal with it when you translate into English now? And so they have a Bavarian accent. So what do you do in the English version? Do you keep the accent, because then it's really weird. Nobody will see it for what it is. Like you will read the English and you won't understand why they're talking such a weird English. So do you find? There's often two options. Or three options. So you leave it out, or you find something that is kind of corresponding to how the Bavarian accent is perceived in the German context. So. Like one suggestion would be, I don't know, like to have them in the North American context, have them speak like a Southerner or someone from Texas or something, which is where you have certain similarities, which is also weird because then you're reading this book about Bavaria and someone speaks like an oil baron from Texas. So and then there's another option, which is to make up something, and I think the translator chose to like partially leave it out or to make up a little bit something that conveys the same feeling that you would have if you read the Bavarian. But yeah, you just can't find it. And this is already very simple task. It's even worse with the like I think 2-3 poems in this book, which are not very beautiful poems. They're supposed to be bad poems. They it's this guy who sings these poems and he makes them up. He thinks they're beautiful. They're not very beautiful. But when I was writing it in German already, it was an issue because I wanted him to be this way, but I realized I didn't know how to. You have to. If you don't do it really well, then people might think that I'm just writing bad poems. So how do you make them so bad that people know they're supposed to be bad? So I was trying this out for a long time, and then I realized the solution was to go back to when I was, 11, 12, and I found some diary of mine, and there were the poems. So I used some of them, and then that's it. But it was very difficult because so this guy rhymes, and then they also make a game with each other. So they say that we have to, we drink and we rhyme, and if you're the first one to, not find a rhyme or make that works, then you lose, And so he had to keep the meaning, but also keep rhymes, and then also make the same rhyme mistake, and that is very difficult. And it was a lot of tasks. I mean, this is not the game, but like for example, just so you have an idea about how nice the poems are, it's here in a tragic scene. It gnaws at the heart. To attempt it is hard. The ocean of feeling tears it apart, while a wrecked voice from a vanishing card whispers, "What are you missing?" So take hold of your heart, kill the pain, stab it 1,000 times, and don't complain, even if doing so drives you insane. You're determined, so it won't be in vain. Proceed with the task, however cruel, however much it makes you feel like a fool. Complete it, and victory is yours. Ignore the despair, ignore the remorse. Then you'll have finally achieved checkmate, and tragedy continues to twist your fate. Yeah. So nice, no? So, but yeah.
I know you've participated in the Tage der Deutschen Literatur
Yeah.
in Klagenfurt. And it seems like a particularly kind of brutal affair for authors to attend that. So I wonder if you could tell us a bit about that, just how you experienced it, what you felt about that kind of a literary competition. It's really nothing like it here. So
Yeah.
it's interesting to hear
So for everybody who doesn't know it, it's like basically it's American Idol for writers. It's just much older and has much more tradition, but and goes back, I don't know, at least 30 years. Yeah. Oh, so even more so. And it was it always happens in Austria, and it's in Austrian television, or now it's also on a television channel that is like a combination of Austria, Germany, and Switzerland. But so each year they invite like the numbers are different. I think they're now less, but it's always like a dozen writers at least. They read. And when I was there, at least, it was already a few years back now, but usually they read for half an hour a text, an unpublished text, and then they have left and right. There are people sitting from the literary industry, usually critics and editors and such. And after the half hour, these guys talk for half an hour about what you've just read. It's all live on TV, and you get to listen what they all hate about your writing. So, I mean, it's a little bit excruciating, but well, I personally felt it was not nearly as bad as I expected it, even though there were like half the jury was against my text. But I think what made it look more harsh is like the whole media effect, first of all, because it just looks different. If it makes a different appearance, especially if you don't see that. Even after the reading and the talk, that someone will come to you and say like, well, but I really liked your other book and stuff. Yeah, of course you don't see that. And generally it's a weird atmosphere in this place, because it's a very beautiful part in Kärnten in Austria, where there's this turquoise lake, and it's in the summertime. So and there's the whole industry goes there for like a week and meets there, and they have all these readings, and everybody meets, and it's almost like a tiny a class meeting of like your high school year or something, because everybody gets together and then everybody goes swimming, and you're like, oh, over there's the critic, who hates my book. Like everybody sees each other half naked, and so that makes it more, I think, a little bit softer than it appears to be. I personally, for example, had the weird problem that I read the text and then I listened to what they were criticizing, and like some guy, for example, was criticizing something which he obviously misunderstood. Like he just read it in a completely different way, and I found that very funny, which was unfortunate, because I realized I was grinning at some point, and I was like, damn, that's TV. But like if they're criticizing it and I'm grinning in TV, and it's like, and then, so I thought like I have to look down, because they might think I'm like arrogant or something. So I just looked down. So you don't see me a lot with my face, you just see my forehead. I mean, and it's also a station kind of that many writers at some point in their career in Germany it's like almost like something you have to do, like you're making your driver's license. At some point you just have to get done with it and then go on, even though it's annoying. It's more about taking part. You're highly unlikely, because it's very. It's very hard to say like what is the best text of these texts that have been read, and there have been widely discussions about. Sometimes you get the impression that it's just a text that has been presented the best way. If you read it terribly, of course, it makes a very different impression. But also, it's often just an excerpt. They read for 25 minutes exactly, I think. So that's about 20 pages, which might be a great text, but it might not say anything about your real skills as a novelist, because most of them are novelists. I mean, maybe you can write 20 pages, which doesn't mean you can, write 100 or say 300. So it is more complex than that. But I think you have just to decide for yourself if you can manage with it and can you deal with it. And yeah, the only thing nowadays is, of course, it's forever there. Like when it was founded, then this was just TV, and then at some point it was gone, like the news and the newspapers. But now it's like recorded, and you can, it's online. You'll see, my whole life I will be able to go back to that moment. It's great. Yes, please.
What is your favorite book?
Yeah. yeah, I never have an answer for that because there's like too many. So and I'm not even. I have like the other question is often what is my favorite writer, and again it's like I feel it's almost unfair to just take one out of this. It's like what is. I could answer what is recently my favorite book, but so.
So I don't
Yeah.
mean to interrupt.
Yeah.
What is your favorite books of the ones that you have personally?
Okay, they're all my favorite books. Yeah. I mean, it's difficult to say. I mean, because after a while you don't look back or you don't look into the older ones anymore. I mean, I hope that still the same way I remember them, but I'm afraid they might not be. You know, it's like a love you had 20 years ago, and it's better maybe the way you remember this person than like trying to meet this person again and figure out if you would still, like this about her or him. And but I mean, it's a good question. But it's really like with books that you've written. It's a little bit, people have often this analogy of it's like when it's published, it's you give birth to a baby, and maybe the book is more painful, as we all know. No, but it's the thing is that it's a little bit like with kids, like they're very different from each other, and you might love them all for different reasons. So I with every book I like them for a certain reason, and of course I do see sometimes that or I have at least the impression that some things I can do better now than I used to. At least that's the illusion I like to live with. So. And right now, of course, the dearest book is the one that is just recently has been published. But still, I do love the others, and maybe I will be responding differently to this question in another 10 years or so, because then maybe I don't remember some of them.
Speaking of giving birth to a book,
Yeah.
what is the gestation time? How long does it take you to write a book?
Well, it's a question of like the writing part, the rewriting part is not usually that long, but the problem is, of course, with writing, we often mean also the times when we don't write. So, and that's why it takes so long to write a book, I feel like, because actually I could sit down and write like, let's say 3-4 pages each day. So in 100 days, I have one book. So in 200 days, I have 2 books. And in 1 year, I have 3 books. So that would be very, very good. But the problem is, of course, I need all this time and to maybe not even like think about it, but actually not think about it. When you're very deep in a book, at some point, there's always this one situation or at that point where I feel like I don't see it anymore. I can't even tell if it's good or it's total crap. And so what I have to do is just leave it alone for a while. And I never know how long that might be. But sometimes it's just a few days, and sometimes it's actually much longer. And then I can go back, and then I can see what works a little bit more and works less. Because although there's this conception that writing is just like one of the arts where it's a creative process, so it's very hard. And it's it's very complicated, and good art there are no rules and stuff, which is partially true. But then again, actually, there are many factors by which you can tell if this is written well or not, and there are really good reasons you can find for why something is not written so well, and that actually sometimes you don't see anymore. So after a while, I can go back to it, and then I can improve it. What also helps is, of course, if you, for example, married to a woman who is also a writer, because then she can be that pair of eyes that sees it much fresher. And we do occasionally, we don't do it a lot because otherwise you end up just talking about the writing. But occasionally we do edit each other's stuff, or at least read it when it's a final version and give our impression. And she's a very good editor. She always finds the weak spots, and I usually react to it by like defending all of it and telling her that, that she's completely wrong. and that she doesn't understand at all, and she should give it another thought. And then I run out of the room and slam the door, and then I change it all. Yes, please.
Yeah, can you enlighten us as to when you started writing and when you discovered that you wanted to write? What you just said about the process of writing, I understand a little bit. A friend of ours is a writer, and I think his family's guinea pigs. They suffer when he tests his expressions and thoughts.
Well, I started like writing, but not seriously, obviously, but writing when I was, I think, 11, due to a moment. I can really distinctively remember when I watched a movie with my father, and my father, he is, most of his life he was an actor, but later became also a producer, although even when he became a movie producer, he still kind of was acting that. So he, when I don't know, where it was, but I remember watching a movie with him and telling him after the movie, like, I didn't like how this ended, and he basically said, well, then just write it, differently, like, you can change it if you want to. Not one of his movies, it was just like some random movie, and that's what I did, and that's when I started, just for the joy of it, and just as a hobby, basically, writing text, and I'm glad that some of them don't exist anymore, because so nobody can read them. They were very much based on what I was reading that time when I was like then a little bit older, maybe 12, 13, which is basically Stephen King stories. So it's like very bad copies of Stephen King stories and some comics and stuff. So that's how I started, and since then I think for many years I just did it out of because it was a nice thing. I just enjoyed it, and I remember often like and I had, I think, the huge advantage actually that not only I didn't have any obstacles in my immediate surroundings, meaning that usually the first people that you have to conquer that you want to write is like immediate family or someone you know looks after you or friends, that because people might be like, yes, you can write, but first become a lawyer and then you can see, because make some money and then you. But so I never had that because my father, he comes from more like acting and writerly family, and so they were never like, oh God, he wants to become a writer. So that was good, but even. He supported in the sense that he never said like you have to become a writer now, but he he took it seriously that I felt taken seriously. He would read the text and then write comments and correct mistakes. Although when I have still some of the pages, if I look at them now, there's more comments and corrections than actual text, because there were so many things about. But that was actually nice. I felt in a very nice way. I repaid it by writing in the beginning a lot also short stories that I would, speaking of guinea pigs, give to my parents or to my sister for birthday or Christmas, like having written something about them. And I, being a real writer, I thought I should be very truthful. So I would always try to be, whatever, with all their faults, everything was in there. And I remember often, it was the same experience that writing the text, being very excited that they would be probably super happy about it because, it was all about them and I did put so much time and effort into it. And then when the day came and it was Christmas or whatever, I was like, yeah, see, here's the text. And then they would be like, yeah, read it to us. And just before I would start reading, I would think, oh, God, what will they say? They will be horrible because everything is in there, like every fight, I witnessed everything. And so I started reading it to them. And what happened is they loved it. Every time they loved it so much. And of course, it wasn't because it was a great text. It was just because it was so much about them. And then they loved the idea that they were like the hero of that text. And it didn't really matter how terribly they were portrayed. They were still like they were the hero of that story. And that was also lots of fun. And I think after, like at some point after school and so on, I feel it was a big part was just luck, because sometimes you just have to meet the right people at the right moment. Of course, you have to. I don't believe in luck in general. I don't believe in sitting at home and waiting for the luck to happen. But I do believe in that if you put some effort in something and you put yourself into the right places, then you're more likely to encounter luck. And that's how I felt. Like I did write a lot, and I did try a lot, and I did then also meet the right people, and I got to study in the right place, and this helped me a lot to to at some point actually get money for the writing, which I find still very astonishing, because it's like I sit in my little room. I actually love to write in bed, just right after getting up. I don't even like sitting at the table, and so I just write there and make up stuff, and then people come and say like, "Here, want to have money for it?" So I do appreciate that a lot, and yeah, I still have this basic feeling that at some point somebody will find out that I'm just actually making up that stuff, and will tell everybody else, and then I'm done, But until then, I just keep doing it.
Yeah. Follow-up question to that: how do you pick your topics, and do you sketch out the book, the outline, or you just start writing and see where it goes?
Topics picking is very random. Like, it's very different how stories or books started. For me, at least, most of the time was just maybe it was a character, maybe it was a sentence or a certain observation, and then I took it from there. Like my first book, for example, someone told me about a family where the mother had died when entering the apartment. She had just slipped and had fallen, and very unfortunately fallen, and she had it's terrible, but she bled to death in the entrance of the apartment, and the family afterwards did not move out. They stayed in this apartment, and they literally, I mean, it's almost like a cliché, but they literally put a carpet over the stain on the floor, and they stayed there, and they, every day they would have to walk through this carpet, and I was like, that's so crazy, and and that was such a strong image that I found that fascinating. I was like, what kind of family could that be? Like, how do they deal with this shit? Like, how can they not see that this must be terrible to put themselves through this? And that's what was the start of a book, which went into many different directions. It's about all these characters who deal with death, and this important death in a different way. But in another story, it might just be a certain observation that, I don't know if you've ever seen that, but I recently saw that, and I started writing, and I didn't know where the story was going, but the observation that when the moon there's a half moon, so in the more like the western hemisphere or northern hemisphere, it's more like a D without this thing, but if you're much more south, like for example when you're in India, it's not a D. The moon is it looks like the smile of the Cheshire cat. It's like a U. For the first time I saw it, I was like, what's going on? But it's very normal there. And I told people, and they're like, what? It looks different where you live? And nobody ever mentioned that to me. I've never seen it mentioned, and then it's just, that's where something started. So that is the topic. And the second question was, sorry.
And do you sketch out the book?
At some point. In the beginning, not, because I am my first reader, so I have to sit every day and sit down, and when I write the next page, I'm also the first one to read it. So if I sketch out too much of it, then it's a very boring task, because imagine every day you get up and you will know exactly what's going to happen in every detail. So I do prefer that I only know. Have a remote or like a specific idea about the ending and where it's heading, but I'd never know which road I'm going to take there. So which is more exciting to me, because then as much as the reader later might be surprised, I am actually in that situation surprised when the housewife doesn't kiss her husband good morning, but stabs him with a knife. So in that sense, I prefer to not know too much.
I think we'll take one more question.
Yeah.
Following up a little bit on the previous questions.
Yeah.
You went to the Literaturinstitut.
In Leipzig.
Perhaps, can you say something about, is it actually possible to train as a writer? How much did you benefit from studying creative writing at the Literaturinstitut?
Yeah, so this place in Leipzig is it's a part of the university where you go and if you generally would describe it, you would say it's kind of creative writing. I think it works a little bit different from how we're used to it in the English-speaking world, but it's very similar and very traditional. But at the same time, there are only very few places in the German-speaking world that actually do that. In fact, there are fairly new places now, one in Austria and one in Switzerland. But in Germany itself, there's this place, and then there's another one that is combined with journalism, and all the others are more like playwriting or script writing. So there's not many places to go to, but I went there and I was very happy about having studied there. But of course, you cannot learn how to write. I mean, the people have to apply, and the people who get in, they kind of, I mean, I don't know if they are writers, but they definitely can write to a certain extent already. What you do learn there, which is more important, is you learn a lot about yourself and your writing. You're just more made aware of things by conversations about texts, and not only about your own text, but mostly also about everybody else's text. So it was the usual hour there, or the usual lesson. What happens is someone has written a text. He has, sent it to everyone in the class. They had a week to read it, and then everybody sits down, and then the professor says, so reading experiences, and then first usually nobody says anything. Then there's this very awful and awkward silence. You just hear the pen clicking, and then at some point someone is like, yeah, okay, and then says, and that's what happened to me in the first lesson. It was like, well, I read your story, and I did like the title. And it's like, ugh. So like one of the things you don't learn is there obviously not only about text, but about how you deal with criticism a lot, and it's like bathing in dragon blood basically, because afterwards these people know you. They know also how to hurt you because they you're very close to them. Later on, it can't be that hard anymore, because if someone criticizes you, mostly people don't really know you, so you can just tell yourself that it's just an asshole, But like with these guys, you know them. So and that's something you deal with, and then also the like it's not like we sit there and say like, oh, today we're going to learn how to write a very good first sentence. So everybody wants, That's not how it works. It's actually almost more the opposite. It's more, people have been describing it as an ivory tower, where a lot of things are allowed, and actually the more conventional and the more classic stuff is more likely to be frowned upon. I mean, like almost a curse word there is like a plot, for example. If you say like, I've plotted the story, it's like, oh, you're plotting the story. But of course, the irony in it is that often afterwards if you enter the publishing world, you realize it doesn't have anything to do with what you've done there. You've learned about writing and about texts and what might work and what might not work, but you haven't learned anything about how publishing works, because publishing and literature are not necessarily really the same thing, and there are many other factors that have to come together other than that you're just a good writer. I mean, there are great writers, there are fabulous writers, and probably some of the best writers that just have never been published, because there are many other aspects that have to come together for you to be actually put on a cover.
So I believe that's all the time we have for questions. I'd like you to join me in thanking our author and reader, Christopher. So he will be available now for further questions, chatting, or if you have a book you'd like to get signed, you can take care of that for you. So he's not going to run away right away. If you have further questions. Thanks for coming out tonight.
Yeah.
Thanks for the questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much.